make sense. So now we want to give you some things to think about. So God is good and God is loving, and that's why he gave us human beings free will. See, God is interested in human beings, not
Ulcer. All right, good evening, everyone. Well, evening, afternoon, like late afternoon, comfortable afternoon. It's good to see you guys. It is 2:02, so we're actually 2 minutes late. But we're going to go ahead and get started with our event for this evening. We want to just officially welcome you to Church on Purpose and to this space. For those of you that are joining us online, we want to say good afternoon. What is it with this good evening stuff today? Good afternoon to you as well. I guess good morning to some of you, depending on what time zone you live in. But we are excited about this evening. We've got a lot that we're going to cram into a 2 hour period. And so that's why we're going to go ahead and get started, go ahead and jump in. And so I want to bring down to kind of set up our time today our Kingdom Education Coordinator, Brother Quentin Rogers, who is going to go ahead and set the tone for the afternoon so that we can keep rocking and rolling and answer this question: is Christianity indeed the white man's religion? Y'all give it up for Q.
All right, what's up, everyone? Glad to see you all. Looking forward to having this conversation today. Of course, we are here today to answer the question and to put to rest the objection, the question: is Christianity the white man's religion? For those who may not be familiar, this is a rather popular question in the urban apologetics space where we deal with, we're apologists, we're Christians who make it their duty to defend the faith, either professionally or as something that they're really passionate about. We answer this kind of question and respond, or we answer this question because it's important with respect to the heritage and the history of the Christian faith. And what it really does is help to not only for the church to strengthen our faith, to strengthen our walk, but also to equip us to be able to engage and to have conversations with those in our families, in our community, on our jobs, wherever we may find people. Urban apologists will tell you that this question, along with a host of others and other objections, are quite common or not. I mean, it's surging, it's emerging in different contexts. And so we found it necessary to host this forum so that we could address this question and equip everyone here who in attendance, who are believers especially, to be able to have these conversations with individuals in a way that is intelligent, in a way where you're informed, but is also empathetic and understanding of those who may have this question or who may be making this objection. And so we're not here to simply just give you some ammo to be able to shoot back in response to individuals who may raise this kind of question, but really to equip you and to give you tools and things necessary to be able to have a conversation, to hopefully help someone to be able to see the error in the question, to be able to kind of push beyond the question itself and get to things that may be driving the question in general. And so today, I want to kind of, before I introduce our speaker for today, I want to kind of give some house rules or some rules of engagement. When you came in, you should have gotten a sheet of paper that has the flyer for the event, and then it has some rules of engagement on the front, and then on the back, you'll see there is just some information about our speaker for today. But for our rules of engagement today, it's very simple. Just if you have any questions and comments, be sure to write them down, because we will have a question and answer period for about the little less than the latter half of our time together today. But we'll be taking your questions and addressing those and answering them. Also, we just ask that you be civil, be respectful. No blurting out, no interrupting, no running up to the front and trying to sock the speaker. None of that. Just keep it cool. Also, because we do have children in the room, and because it's just not becoming of this kind of discourse and this kind of occasion, that any derogatory language, swearing, that not take place as well. Of course, what we'll do during the question and answer period, like I said, you'll have an opportunity to do so. When we get to that point, you'll be able to walk up to the microphone. We'll have a microphone here in the center of the room where you'll be able to walk up and ask your questions. We ask that when you ask your question that you not give your whole entire life story with the question, because we want to try and get to as many of them as possible. So we ask you keep your questions to about 30 seconds or less. And if we do have time, if it's short enough and you have a follow-up question, that'll be allowed as well. And then, of course, if you have your phone with you, which I'm sure we all do in the 21st century, please go to the church Facebook page, Church on Purpose, and share this broadcast. I'm sure there's some people in your family. Brother Adam made the joke yesterday. Said, all of us probably know somebody who in the family last year came to the cookout. Their name was Charles, but this year their name is Shabazz. Go ahead and send Brother Charles Shabazz the copy of the link to this broadcast so he can watch and get some education. All right. So go ahead and share the broadcast on your Facebook page. It is public, so we ask that you do that as well. And, of course, send messages to people that if they're on their way, say, hey, come on, don't want to miss it. Come on out and join us. And, of course, let them know we're here. For those joining us online, thank you all so much for joining us. We really, really appreciate it. We're excited that you're able to tune in with us online. If you have questions that you would like to have addressed in the room, we'll be taking those. Just simply drop your question in the comment below in the video. And when you do, we will have our moderator for the broadcast to be able to jot those questions down, to share them, and to have them read here in the room. So with that being said, the gentleman that is going to be coming before you, some of you all saw him this morning. He was our preacher for this morning and did an awesome job sharing the word with us. But this gentleman is someone who I've grown to respect highly for the work that he's doing and the work that he's putting in. He's not just an apologist, but he is also a full-time husband and father of 4 kids. And he also works a full-time job, and so he does this urban apologetics in his spare time. And with that spare time, he really does a wonderful, wonderful job. You all, once you all have gotten a chance, when you all get the chance to do so, be sure to go to his YouTube page, the True ID Podcast, True ID Apologetics. You can go there and subscribe to his page. You can check him out online. Has some really, really awesome content where he interviews different people. But just all in all, a really good brother in Christ, confident in what he shares, has a wonderful style of engaging and fostering dialogue with people. And so I'm excited that he's here to share with us today. So you all help me to welcome and to receive Brother Adam Coleman.
All right, make sure I'm turned on here. All right. Oh, it's okay. Oh, okay. Oh, cool. Thank you. I think you told me how to work it. On the right goes forward. Okay. All right, cool. All right, how y'all doing? All right. Long time no see. Yeah. Right. Well, glad to be back here in here one more again. I'm Adam Coleman, host of True ID Podcast, founder of True ID Apologetics. And quick question: can I start the slide now? If I push the button, will it go? Or okay, there we go. True ID Podcast. Isn't that a nice logo, y'all? Y'all like that? Okay, yeah. Check us out on Facebook and everything. We'll get to that later on. So the question before us today: is Christianity the white man's religion? Just by a show of hands, like how many people have either ever asked that question themselves or been confronted with it, or kind of heard people kind of throw that around? Anybody? Okay, cool. So I'm not by myself, all right? Oh, you haven't? Okay, good. That's a good thing. See, we were just talking about shining our light this morning. I guess that's you just been shining so bright. It doesn't even happen to you like that. That's all right. All right. So we're going to be tackling that question today. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with prayer, if that's all right, y'all. And then we'll be moving forward. Father, we just thank you for giving us another opportunity to come before you and just learn the wonderful things that you have done in the earth realm, Lord God, and learn ways to defend the faith and be able to dialogue with family members, friends, and anybody that we come in contact such that we can point them back towards you. We give you thanks for this time. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, excuse me. In his legendary work, Souls of Black Folks, W.E.B. Du Bois famously said that the problem of the 20th century will be the problem of the color line. Right? I'm having a little trouble with the clicker here. do I need to point it at that? Is that how that works? Okay. Point it that way. Okay, cool. So, all right. Yeah, so W.E.B. Du Bois said that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, right? Now, when we think about all the racial tension of the 20th century, whether it be rashes of lynchings that Ida B. Wells spoke out against, the civil rights movement, think about Bull Connors and marchers being hit with billy clubs and blasted with high-powered water hoses and things of that nature, we can say with some confidence that W.E.B. Du Bois was right on the money in terms of his prediction about what the 20th century would look like. With that being said, I think more and more it's becoming apparent that Christianity, the church and Christianity more broadly, has also had to grapple with this color line, this identity issue, right? This color line has been the source of not only social and political unrest, but also for scores of people, it has become a cause for spiritual unrest, okay? Now, what do I mean by that? Well, going back to the transatlantic slave trade, you have this diversity of people from West Africa, including like the Awe, the Yoruba, the Igbo, the Congolese, all experiencing this identity disruption as they are ripped away from the network of factors by which people generally develop a sense of identity, okay? Having been this diverse group, they're actually brought in chains here to the Western world and then lumped all into one racially defined category, black, all right? So the slave trade instigated such a profound loss of self and thirst to reclaim that lost Africanity, so to speak, that many who struggle with filling that identity gap feel compelled to embrace what they believe to be African and at the same time cast off what they perceive to be European, right? And unfortunately, Christianity is often seen as being on the wrong side of that ledger, okay? Now, I want to just take a second to dig a little deeper to understand what's really going on there, all right? First off, I want us to think about the concept of worldview. Everybody say worldview. All right. Ooh, this one, okay. So a worldview is pretty much how it sounds, right? It's the lens through which you see the world, right? One way we can understand how worldviews work would be to say that it's kind of like a puzzle, right? And each puzzle piece represents something that you believe to be true about the world or real, and something about reality, right? And when you take each of those pieces and put them all together, it's like you get your big picture. That's your worldview, the lens through which you see the world. Now, when it comes to these white man's religion thing, this white man's religion concern, I think what we have happening is people are looking at the identity puzzle piece, and their spirituality puzzle piece, and they're saying that there's some tension. They don't fit together well. Or to make it more explicit, they're looking at that African ethnicity and heritage and saying that that puzzle piece doesn't fit with the Christianity puzzle piece. And so what they do is say, well, you can look in the mirror and see that you're black. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that out. It's taken as a given. And so therefore, if this Christianity puzzle piece isn't fitting, I need to cast off that Christianity puzzle piece and find a different piece that will align, a different piece, form of spirituality that will align or not be in conflict with my African ethnicity and heritage, right? Now, I think that the reasons people believe there to be a conflict between African ethnicity and heritage and Christianity boils down to two main misconceptions, okay? First, it's the perception that Christianity is foreign to their African heritage such that it should be rejected, all right? And then secondly, it's this notion that given the relationship between the church and oppressive forces in modern history, Christianity cuts against personal value, right? I think those are the two main streams kind of fueling these questions that we get about Christianity being the white man's religion, right? Just think about it. When you think about oppression here in the West, by and large, it's been predicated upon this notion of you can take race and racism and then justify treating humans inhumanely. That's been the bulk of what we've experienced here in the West. And so me being human, if I think that there's this belief system that is locked arm in arm with people groups and systems that cut against my humanity, then of course, naturally I'm going to reject that. I'm going to say, well, hey, I don't know what's going on with this Christian God over here, but I don't need that. I can do bad all by myself. I'm saying to throw him to the wayside. And I think that's really what's fueling the question, is Christianity white man's religion? This notion of this foreignness, supposedly, of Christianity with respect to African heritage and this idea of personal value, right? So the perception is that there's this Uncle Tomness to being both black and Christian, and it's driven many people of African descent into the arms of other belief systems like the Hebrew Israelites, the Kemetics, African spiritual systems, Nation of Islam, and so forth, or even a form of atheism that many people refer to as black atheism, right? Because people are seeking another puzzle piece that they believe to be in line with their African ethnicity and heritage. But again, as I said, I would argue that both of these notions are mistaken, and I would argue on historical and philosophical grounds that we have good reason to reject each of them. And in their place, I'm going to be pursuing two main arguments as a sort of cure or medication for the diagnosis that we've made so far. Firstly, I'm going to argue that there are historical reasons for affirming that Christianity is not incompatible with African ethnicity and heritage. And secondly, I'm going to be arguing that Christianity itself does not undermine the personal value of African people and their descendants. Y'all with me so far? We good? I'm trying to lay a little groundwork here. Okay. So very briefly, we'll be taking a little journey through history to kind of explore this topic further. Now, interestingly enough, really everything I'm sharing with you now is a part of my story, right? I mean, I was grappling with this question myself about 5 or 6 years ago. I'll never forget, man, I was at the job just listening to different guys on YouTube, and they were making these claims about Christianity being the white man's religion, and I didn't have a response for it. And I also have a cousin who happens to be a Kemetic, and he was hitting me with some stuff like, man, you need to get on this horror stuff and da-da-da-da. And again, I didn't have a way to engage him because I'd never really thought these things through for myself, right? And so I found myself grappling with these questions and not really understanding a way forward on it. And so one day I just felt compelled to just, Google. I was about to say look in the yellow pages, but we don't have yellow pages now. I felt compelled to Google a local church, some African, anything that sounded African. That's what I was looking for, And I came across a Coptic church, contacted the priest, and long story short, I was able to set up a meeting with them to try to, wrestle with these questions to get a better understanding. And I show up to this Coptic church, and from the moment that I walk in, I was just floored because it was the first time that I walked into a place and saw African faces along the wall. I mean, he had pictures of Abba Anthony, Abba Moses, Cyprian, some of the guys we're going to be talking about in a minute. And just immediately, I felt struck because it was just the first time I really felt at home in my faith as a person of African descent, So, what I'm sharing with you today, these are all things that have kind of, flowed from my story, and I hope you're able to kind of get that same experience as we move forward, okay? So with that said, let's go here. Now, with that being said, there's every indication that before the close of the 1st century, Christianity had already reached Africa, particularly Egypt. According to the oral history of the Coptic Church, Christianity was introduced to Egypt by Mark, the apostle, who was reportedly martyred in Alexandria, Egypt later on. This is actually St. Mark's Cathedral is standing today, which is supposedly was raised at the place where that St. Mark was martyred, right? Now, listen, it would be just a complete understatement for me to say that Alexandria was just of crucial significance to the church, in those first early centuries. Actually, before the close of the 2nd century, Alexandria, Egypt is already one of the 4 major hubs of Christianity alongside Antioch, Rome, and of course Jerusalem, right? As a matter of fact, before the close of the 2nd century, the first Christian school of theology anywhere on the planet was founded in Alexandria, Egypt. It was called the Alexandria Catechetical School. Alexandria Catechetical School. I probably should have said this up front. You may want to take some notes. We'll be covering about 2,000 years of history, so you might want to kind of jot some things down as we go, right? So yeah, the Alexandria Catechetical School, I mean, you have some real heavyweights, coming out of there, like a guy named Origen, right? He's actually credited with being the father of systematic theology, right? He's also the first guy to engage in what we call textual criticism, right, within the church. So textual criticism is where scholars will take different manuscripts of different documents and try to compare them against one another to find out what the original said. And Origen had this thing what he called the hexapla, where it was a Bible with 6 different translations all lined up with one another. So as he would study, he could compare and contrast as he went. He was the first person to do that. And so it kind of gave birth to textual criticism today. Again, a theologian from Alexandria, Egypt. Went through the Alexandria Catechetical School. You also have a gentleman by the name of Didymus the Blind. As you might imagine, he was blind, and he was actually known to have carved Bible verses in wood, so that he could read them. So it was like an early form of Braille. I'm saying that's how he studied the scriptures. Early theologian from Alexandria, Egypt. Now, actually, before I move on from Alexandria, I gotta highlight my boy right quick. Saint Maurice. I mean, just think about like Maurice, just the name right there. Like, he black. You know what I'm saying? It's just Saint Maurice, right? You can actually look at him. Look, he's rocking a hoodie right there, or something like that. But ancient hoodie. Now, Saint Maurice was an early martyr of the Christian church. He was actually a commander of a regiment of soldiers in the Roman army. And so Emperor Maximus one day comes to him and says that he wants him to attack a group of Christians that had some sort of uprising. But being a Christian himself, Saint Maurice said, I'm not going to do it. And he commanded his regiment, who were also Christians from Egypt, to stand down. And they refused to attack these fellow Christians. And so Maximus' orders was called decimation. Right? Now, decimation was where they would take 1 out of every 10 in your regiment and just execute them right on the spot. So he orders that. You got one wave of guys get executed. Saint Maurice still refuses. And so Maximus orders another decimation. Say, okay, that's another 1 out of every 10. Gone. Boom. Executed. And so, Saint Maurice and his regiment of Christians, they still refuse to attack these fellow believers. And so ultimately, unfortunately, Maximus orders the execution of the entire regiment, and they all become martyrs for the faith. This is an early Christian martyr document. It's the earliest one of the earliest documents, I should say. All right. Oh man, that's my dude, man. Maurice went hard in the paint. With that being said, let's move a little bit forward onto some other regions in the northern part of Africa. Right. In a work entitled "Apology," written in about 197 A.D., a North African lawyer by the name and theologian by the name of Tertullian references the rapid spread of Christianity in North Africa. Let me just read this quote here. He says, "We are but of yesterday, and we have already filled every place among you, cities, islands, fortresses, towns, marketplaces, the very camps and tribes, companies, palaces, senates and forums, and so on." Right? So what we have here in Tertullian's work is textual evidence of Christianity being present in North Africa in the 2nd century. But in addition to that, this textual evidence is great, but we also have archaeological evidence that Christianity was present in North Africa in the 2nd century. This right here is a picture of a burial ground in a place called Hadramawet, North Africa. It spans about 5 kilometers wide, right? Now, this burial ground has been dated to have been in use between the 2nd and the 4th century. They've counted approximately 15,000 graves, and many of them bear inscriptions and motifs like the so-called Jesus fish, on the tombs and whatnot, by which they know that it was a Christian burial ground, right? Historian actually Francois de Quay reports that further evidence suggests that churches had been planted in Carthage, North Africa, before the end of the 1st century, right? So as I say all the time, man, like when it comes to Christianity, like, as far as African people, we're not new to this, man. We're true to this. We've been here since the beginning. And that's just a fact. But, moving on from the 3rd century, we see Christianity showing up in what is now Algeria and Tunisia, further over into Mauritania, which is modern-day Morocco, Libya. And, of course, we have Aksum, what we would call Ethiopia, being declared a Christian nation under King Azana in the 4th century, right? Actually, this right here, this is what they call the Azana coin. And, if you look here on the right, you see that cross in the middle, right? So apparently it's reported that you have this man named Frumentius, right? And he's either, taken in by pirates or shipwrecked, but one way or the other ends up in service to the king. Kind of like a Joseph kind of a situation, right? And so ultimately he becomes the tutor of young Azana, who's Prince Azana. And when Prince Azana rose to power, he eventually converts to Christianity and then declares Ethiopia to be a Christian nation. And so this is actually a coin that was minted during Azana's time. And you see that cross in the middle there, demonstrating his kind of affirmation of Christianity in Ethiopia. Aside from that, though, this right here, in Ethiopia, we have these churches that are actually carved out of rock. You see, kind of like the mountainside. This church was carved out of the rock that's surrounding it. They found a number of these churches, right? This one here is probably about a little bit over 800 years old in Ethiopia, right? just this past December, they found another one that dates back to about the 4th century, making it over 1,500 years old. Churches just like these. I think I have another picture. You can kind of, you can't see it there, but it's actually, if you see the other side, it's in the shape of a cross. You kind of see the four wings there of a cross, so to speak, right? So then, of course, you have ancient Nubia. You know, we got a little shout out to my man King Silko right quick. This is one of his inscriptions. Ancient Nubia, which is modern-day Sudan, is Christianized in about 450 A.D. and remains Christian up until about the 14th century. So when you just do the math, you've got this Christian nation on the continent of Africa for about 1,000 years, with all of that coming before the transatlantic slave trade. How many of y'all have seen or heard about the Hidden Colors video or some of these documentaries or all that kind of? Yeah, you have. How come they don't ever talk about this stuff right here? That's what I want to know. A Christian nation on the continent of Africa for 1,000 years before the transatlantic slave trade. But the YouTube, I think my man said YouTube University. They don't like to talk about that part. You know what I'm saying? Right. All right. Now, it's important to remember that when I'm talking about Christianity spreading through Africa, I'm not just saying that you have Africans being preached to by outsiders and just kind of going along with the ride. You know, from the earliest days of church history, we see Africans taking a lead role in the building of the church, whether it be in the formulation of key doctrines, instituting certain religious practices, or even contributing to certain philosophical developments within the church. We'll just kind of give a couple examples here. For example, Tertullian. Shouted him out a second ago. He's a theologian from North Africa, reportedly to be of Berber descent. The Berbers are an indigenous ethnic group in North Africa. Now, one of the most central doctrines in really the church is the doctrine of the Trinity. Right, it's one of the distinctions that we have. Right. Well, where do you think we get the word Trinity from? You might have guessed it. From Tertullian. Right. Tertullian was known to be the father of Latin theology because he wrote his works, his theological works in Latin. It was believed to be the first person to do so, right? And the word Trinity comes from the Latin word Trinitas, which you find in his work titled Apology, right? Where he lays out an in-depth defense of an early conception of the Trinity, right? And actually, we can take it even a step further than that. Sometimes I like to joke that Tertullian is kind of like, you ever heard of E40? Anybody? You got any hip-hop E40? Well, E40 is referred to as being like the lexicon of hip-hop. He's always coming up with different words. That's kind of how Tertullian was, you know what I'm saying? Because you got, he comes up with the term the Trinity. But actually also when you look at your Bibles, when you think about the Old Testament, New Testament, those terms were actually coined by Tertullian as well. So when you pick up your Bible, you have this African influence already that most of us aren't aware of. But on top of that, I got to bring this up as well. How many folks have ever heard of the infamous Council of Nicaea? Anybody? Yeah, you got all kind of pseudo scholars online. Everything happened at the Council of Nicaea. Supposedly, it's all kind of conspiracy theories. Jesus was created at the Council of Nicaea. The Bible was written at the Council of Nicaea. Popeyes got the recipe for the chicken sandwich at the Council of Nicaea. I mean, it's always whatever. Any kind of conspiracy theory, you're gonna pin it on the Council of Nicaea. But so for those who don't know, basically what you had with the Council of Nicaea is there was this Libyan priest in Alexandria, Egypt, named Arius, right? And he was basically teaching that Jesus wasn't God in the same sense that the Father is God, that he was a created being and not eternal and so on. So obviously this caused quite a stir, and they ended up having a council in Alexandria, Egypt to correct it. And so ultimately, Arius didn't want to back down. So they refuted his doctrine, gave him the boot, and he just relocated to other parts of the Roman Empire and kept teaching this stuff, right? And so this became such a problem in the church that it was basically kind of like church-wide. It was no longer just an Alexandrian issue. Now, at the same time, you have Constantine, Emperor Constantine, who had just kind of like risen to power in Rome, and his thing was he just wanted peace in the empire. He didn't want people beefing because then that would make problems for him. And so what he did was he convened a council at a place called Nicaea in order to resolve this theological issue about the nature of Christ and so on, right? So that's kind of how you get the Council of Nicaea. Maybe we can get back to that later. But I brought all that up to say that Tertullian, when the council comes together and tries to get an understanding of what's the best way to grasp and articulate the doctrine of the Trinity, they rely heavily on Tertullian's work. So you see, actually I've got here in bold, this is a passage from the Nicene Creed, which comes out of the Council of Nicaea in a later council as well, where it talks about the Son of God, the only begotten of the Father for all ages, light of light, true God of true God, begotten, not made. You see this language here where it talks about one essence. I mean, these are some key terms in the Council of Nicaea about which they were able to articulate what exactly they meant by, the Father being God, Jesus being God, and the Holy Spirit. So that's from the Nicene Creed. But then when you look in Tertullian's work, you see some of that same language. And Tertullian comes along about a century before the Council of Nicaea. So they're relying upon Tertullian's work to say some of the same things. Son of God is called from God from unity and substance and all that kind of stuff. The key word here is substance, which maybe we can get back into that in the Q&A. That's a little bit confusing. But that's Christ is spirit of spirit, God of God, and light of light, as light of light is kindled. So they're really borrowing from Tertullian's work as they're trying to really reconcile what's going on here with the Trinity. Now, the reason why it's significant, I mean, quite frankly, I can't think of any council or theological debate that's been more pivotal than the Council of Nicaea. I mean, this was a huge moment in church history. And what you find there right at the Council of Nicaea is that you have this African influence. It's the African theologian named Tertullian whose work has really shaped that conversation. All right? Okay. We can also talk about my boy Athanasius. All right? Athanasius was a powerful theologian who was also at the Council of Nicaea. He's from Alexandria, Egypt, and really championed the correct understanding of who Jesus is and Trinitarianism and whatnot. Maybe we can get back to that. But what's interesting is that Athanasius is eventually installed as a bishop of Alexandria, and a part of the duties that he has to follow up on flows from what they call some of the minor decisions of the Council of Nicaea. There was a lot of debate about when was the proper day to celebrate the resurrection and the Passover lamb. And so what they decided at Nicaea was that every year the bishop of Alexandria would write a letter to all the churches setting the date, right? And so the bishops, what they would do is they would take this opportunity to basically address other theological issues or church-related issues, not just the date. They would just kind of tackle a whole bunch of stuff, you know what I'm saying? So they're not writing 50 different letters, right? Now, in the 39th letter, written by Athanasius, he actually lists out the 27 books that we have in our New Testament today. And it's the first documented list of the New Testament letters in terms of it being authoritative in the church, right? So, further than that, well, actually, I just want to pause there and just kind of think about that. I mean, just look at your New Testament, right? Yeah, there's 27 books. I mean, how important is it when you think about the African influence in the very structure and content of the Bible that we read every week, right? So again, that just kind of speaks to the fact that Africans, we're not just bystanders, we're really involved in the nitty-gritty of how Christianity has progressed. But with that said, I got to talk about my man, Augustine. I could do a whole presentation on Augustine. That's my dude. You know what I'm saying? He's another North African theologian from a place called Tagas, and he's born about the late 4th century. Ethnically, he's also reported to be of Berber descent. Now, again, the Berbers are an indigenous African tribe. And scholars note that Augustine's mother, her name was Monica, and Monica was a popular or common Berber name. So from that, they just derived that he was, at least on his mother's side, Berber descent, right? And so we will visit a lot of his stuff in a minute, but I just want to take a note real quick that in Augustine's writings, he also affirms the same 27 books of the Bible that we have in our New Testament today, right? With that being said, towards the end of the 4th century, in 393 AD, they have a church council in a place called Carthage, right? Everybody say Carthage. All right. They have a church council in Carthage, and it's the first time that a church council weighs in on what books of the Bible, are considered to be, which writings are to be considered as authoritative. It's what we call the process of canonization, right? Basically, kind of make it simple, canonization is basically the process by which the church came to recognize or understand which scriptures were authoritative, right? Now, this was the first council in 393 AD in Carthage where a council weighed in on it. And later on, you find in later councils where they're really trying to firm that notion up, they rely upon these councils' rulings, so to speak, to understand which scriptures are to be taken as authoritative. Now all three of these councils, the Council of Carthage in 393 AD, the Council of Carthage in 397 AD, and also in 419 AD. In these three councils, Augustine is kind of overseeing them all, and they rely upon his works, you know what I'm saying, and really solidifying this notion that the 27 books that we have in our New Testament today are indeed authoritative. So again, I just want to kind of just really drive that home. I mean, when it comes to Christianity, and the development of the Christian church, doctrines and so forth, Africans are not like on the periphery. Okay, we're right there in the mix, making like significant contributions. I mean, how much more significant can it be than really dealing with matters of what's in the biblical text, right? Okay, so just to kind of put a bow on this point about African Christianity, I just want you to kind of like think about this for a second, all right? Britain, Spain, France, the Danish, and Portugal, right? Those are the 5 nations that were most involved on the European side of the transatlantic slave trade, okay? Now, of all those nations, Britain is considered to be the oldest in terms of, resembling anything that it looked like during, the transatlantic slave trade. Britain is the oldest one, okay? Now, Britain dates back to about the 5th century, right? So that means that you have Christianity flourishing on the continent of Africa for 5 centuries before any of the nations that enslaved our ancestors even existed. Just a little food for thought there. Again, we're not new to this, intruders, man. We've been around for a while. Now, with that being said, just for the naysayers out there, I know that, not to say that you guys are naysayers, maybe somebody online or something like that, I just want to clarify. But, a lot of times people will try to argue back and say that, I've just named out places that are in North Africa or in East Africa. But what about the West Africans? Our people were taken from West Africa. So what can be said about the interaction between West Africans, enslaved persons, and Christianity? So, lest I be accused of not tying up those loose ends, I want to take a moment to address this this dynamic between African enslaved persons and Christianity as they encountered it. Now, just real quick, I just want to say this. Like, when I first started digging into this stuff for myself, again, I was grappling with these questions as well, right? And when I first started, this was kind of the notion that I had in my mind, right, in terms of how African enslaved persons became Christians. You got the slave master in a Kunta Kinte type scenario where he's got the Bible in one hand and a bullwhip in the other, beating Christianity into the slave. I call that the Farrakhan version of history. But anyway, that was my understanding, and that was all I knew about it. But one day I just felt compelled to look into it for myself. So I decided I was going to read some slave narratives, right? Accounts of slaves' experiences in their own words. And I came across this quote that I want to read to you right quick that really shook me up at the time. And now, these are the words of former slave John Brown, who's describing what Sundays were like on the plantation. He talks about how it was pretty much a light work day. Everybody would gather at the slave master's house, and this is what he has to say here. Okay, he says, Master John's wife would start the meeting with a prayer, and then would come the singing, the old-timey songs. But the white folks on the next plantation would beat their slaves for trying to do like we did. No praying there and no singing, end quote. Now, this really struck me right here because, again, in my mind, all the thing I knew about was like that Kunta Kinte scenario where you had Christianity getting beaten to the slaves, used to, subjugate them and so forth. And so I thought this was kind of odd, right? But then it dawned on me that maybe I didn't know the whole story, It just really occurred to me that there's actually a diversity of ways in which African enslaved people came into contact with Christianity. And so I started to dig a little further. I want to kind of share some of those insights. So earlier, I used the example of a puzzle to kind of talk about worldviews. And actually, I think that when it comes to history, that same analogy works pretty well here. Because if you have just one piece of information, then you can draw really wrong conclusions about things that happened in the past. But the more information you have, you can put those pieces together and get a better picture in terms of what happened, right? So we want to kind of take some time to do that. Right? Now, I actually have a whole presentation on this subject where I cover about 7 points, but for the sake of time, we'll just be covering 3 of the main ones, what I call the 3 Ps, all right? Prevention, personal resistance, and public resistance. Let's go ahead and say that. Prevention, personal resistance, and public resistance. Usually if I'm dealing with somebody who has these kind of concerns and I want to address them in a quick manner, I kind of just run through these 3 Ps, so that's how it can be helpful. All right, so prevention. First of all, I hear a lot of folks asking today, well, why did our oppressors give us the Bible? Anybody ever heard that? Anybody? No? Okay, cool. Why did our oppressors give us the Bible? Or something along those lines. Well, I think an equally valid question is, why is it that so many enslavers actively oppose Christianity being preached to enslaved persons? As former enslaved person W.L. Ball said, us slaves never have a chance to go to Sunday school and church. The white folks feared for slaves to get any religion and education, but I reckon something inside just told us about God and there was a better place hereafter. We would sneak off and have prayer meetings. Sometimes the patrollers would catch us and beat us good, but that didn't keep us from trying. That's W.L. Balls. And basically what he's describing there is that, back in during the slavery times, they weren't free to practice Christianity any way they wanted. If it wasn't under the direct supervision of the slave masters, then it wasn't going down. So often what they would do is they, say during the day when people are working, there might be one person who would break a tree branch, kind of pointing the direction to where the prayer meeting would be for that night. And they would sneak off at night into what they call hush harbors. That's where they'd be able to pray independently, praise and worship independently without, the slave master trying to regulate this or that. And so, if they got caught, it could be some real repercussions, even death possibly, right? So what they would do is, if they wanted to sing, pray, or something like that, they would have this basin with water in it, and they would sing into that or pray into that to dampen the sound so they wouldn't get caught. There's also records of they would actually take wet blankets, and they would create like an enclosure with wet blankets. They called it their tabernacle, right? And they would be able to pray and worship and do what they needed to do. But again, those wet blankets would dampen the sound. And that's how they were able to practice Christianity independent and really contrary to, the slave masters at the time. Now, I want to say this, just to kind of explain why many enslavers prevented the preaching of the gospel to enslaved persons. This person here, Dr. Catherine Gerber, puts it this way in her article entitled "The Ultimate Sin: Christianizing Slaves in Barbados in the 17th Century." She says, quote, "Slave owners' initial confusion about the consequences of slave conversion is representative of a far more general confusion about the repercussions of Christianity on slavery in the Protestant Atlantic world. Slave owners," am I the wrong one? Oops, sorry, I meant to give you that quote. "Slave owners did not know whether they would be forced to free or eventually manumit their slaves if the latter were converted to Christianity. Some were also concerned that Christianity would give slaves dangerous ideas about equality, about freedom, and allow them to become too similar to their Christian masters," end quote. That's Dr. Catherine Gerber. Now, it was a pretty reasonable fear, for enslavers at the time to be concerned about the legalities of slavery, because under English common law, during the colonial period, most of America was under English common law. Under English common law, it was illegal to own a Christian as a slave. So what happens is you have these African enslaved persons who come over and they're getting baptized and professing Christ and so forth. And so then it's like, well, logically, don't you kind of have to set them free at that point? And so that was the angst that these slave masters had. So it's like, okay, well, in order just to avoid that whole scenario, I just won't let them get preached to. If they don't get preached to, they can't get saved. They don't get saved, I don't have to let them go. That was the rationale of the enslavers. So that's why they didn't allow it. So actually throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, there are a number of legal cases in which African enslaved persons attempted to work through the courts and argue for their freedom on the basis of having converted to Christianity. So, for example, in the U.S., we have Felix's petition to a Massachusetts court in 1773, Peter Best's petition for freedom in 1773, and a petition made by a number of Africans to Judge Thomas Gage in 1774. And actually, this is an actual quote from one of those petitions I want to read just so you can kind of see the logic that they employed in trying to argue for their freedom on the basis of them having converted to Christianity. It says, quote, "By our deplorable situation, we are rendered incapable of showing our obedience to Almighty God. How can a slave perform the duties of a husband to a wife or parent to his child? How can a husband leave master and work and cleave to his wife? How can the wife submit themselves to their husbands in all things? How can the child obey their parents in all things?" End quote. This is from a petition to Thomas Gage in 1774. Now, the rationale here is very simple, is that they're saying that the very conditions of slavery do not allow for enslaved persons to live out and fulfill what God requires of us all. And so given the fact that slavery itself has them in this situation where they have to offend God's law, on that basis, the judge ought to let them free, right? And so actually some of these folks were successful. Unfortunately, I think my home state of Virginia might have been the first to pioneers. I have to do more research, but they actually began to change the laws such that it made it explicit that baptism would no longer be a means to freedom. They actually put it on the law books. That wouldn't be the case. I want to say, like, I think in my state of Virginia, I think it was in 1684 they made that legal change. I want to say we were the first to do so, but I'm not trying to claim it like that. So, so maybe I was blaming on somebody else. But yeah, so we'll move on from there. So my next point relates to the second of the three P's. All right, y'all remember the three P's? Maybe anybody write it down. I'm G checking y'all. I was making sure y'all. Oh, okay, cool. All right, y'all with it. Y'all with it. All right, okay. They're not playing around, Pastor John. They own it, you know. All right, cool. So this is the second of the three P's, right? As African enslaved persons, they engage Christianity as a form of personal resistance. All right. Now we have to really grasp the mindset that was floating around Europe and the Americas during the time period in which slavery was in full swing. Right. We'll get to this a little bit further down the road, but just really shortly, in order to justify enslaving Africans, you had the intellectual elites of the time buy into belief that Africans were literally less than human, or at best were like, a race of adult subhumans that needed to be cared for, by the more civilized races, or they didn't have souls and things of that nature. So I often, tell people that today, folks typically look at racism as being like kind of an emotional or opinion-based like disposition towards other people, but really, we're going back to this period, it's more bare knuckle than that. I mean, we're talking about people who literally believe that Africans were not human. I mean, that's a whole other level, you know what I'm saying? With that being said, the conversion experiences for many African enslaved persons who accepted Christianity serve as like an anchor for their personhood and personal value, okay? And it anchored their self-worth in something that was beyond the reach of the enslaver's ability to degrade them. So this right here, this is actually Dr. Albert Rabbitoe, professor emeritus of Princeton University. And in one of his books, God Struck Me Dead, in the foreword, he says this, quote, "Amidst a system bent on reducing them to an inferior status, the experience of conversion rooted deep within the slave convert's psyche a sense of personal value and individual importance that helped to ground their identity in the unimpeachable authority of Almighty God." End quote. Actually, I can't really think of a better example of that than there's a gentleman by the name of Josiah Henson. Anybody familiar with Uncle Tom's Cabin? Heard Uncle Tom's Cabin? Yeah. So, now that's pretty much, nobody wants to be called Uncle Tom. It's, when I was coming up, I guess they switched it up. It was like Carlton Banks. If somebody called you a Carlton Banks, it was like the same kind of meaning, you know what I'm saying? There was Clarence Thomas for a while, but, anyway. Unfortunately, actually, the Uncle Tom actually wasn't a negative initially. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote that book to demonstrate the humanity of African enslaved persons. And she based the character, Uncle Tom, on a real gentleman by the name of Josiah Henson, right? Or Reverend Josiah Henson, I should say. Now, Henson had been born into slavery, but managed to escape and went about as a renowned minister and abolitionist. And in one version of his autobiography, there's this interesting exchange between Henson and the wife of his former enslaver that I really want to draw our attention to. So Henson reports that after living as a free man for about 50 years, he just had this desire to go back to the place where he'd come from. He wanted his wife to see from where he'd come. And so he arrives at this Maryland plantation, and he describes it as being just run down, kind of a shell of what it used to be, just not quite the farm that he had remembered growing up. And likewise, the wife of his former enslaver, she was just in real bad health, just real bad shape, couldn't hardly see. Her memory was real sketchy. She was bedridden. And so he goes in to see her, and she initially, the wife of his former enslaver doesn't recognize him, right? And so earlier in his autobiography, he talks about how he had saved the life of his former enslaver one day, and in the process, he had just shattered his arms, got tore up, and he still had these scars that he bore for the rest of his life. And so, as he goes in to see the wife of the slave master, he allows her to feel the scars to kind of jog her memory of who he is. And so she touches the scars, and immediately she remembers. Remembers who he is. She says, "Oh, Sai," it's short for Josiah. She says, "Oh, Sai, I'm sorry to tell you this, but your master is dead and gone." And then he responds to her by saying, "No, madam, my master is yet alive." He's referring to Jesus Christ. See, my master is yet alive. I mean, this simple yet profound statement gives us a glimpse at what Christian conversion was for so many African enslaved persons. It was, in a sense, a declaration that you may have my body, but you can't have my soul. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about the conversion experience of African enslaved persons. So in a sense, just giving themselves over to the lordship of Jesus Christ, enslaved persons found liberty from their earthly master through submitting to the master of us all. So this conviction coming from a place of God-given worth was foundational for the black church and the black community more broadly during the period where Africans were fighting for not only abolition, but really on up through the civil rights movement as well, right? So this leads us to the third of our 3 Ps, right? Public resistance. Now, it's just a historical fact that Christianity provided a framework for public resistance of slavery. I mean, the fact of the matter is, whether it be abolition, civil rights movement, whatever, there has been no force in American history that's been more potent for African freedom than Christianity. That's just a fact. It's not even arguable. So when I talk about public resistance, I mean, there's a lot of different directions I could go with it. I mean, we could call out a number of abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, Alado Equiano, Adebayo, Henry Highland Garnett, James Wesley Le Guin. We could talk about Martin Delany. It's actually my personal favorite. I mean, there's just so many few people that we can name who opposed slavery on the basis of their Christian convictions. And let me just say this right quick. We're in Black History Month, right? I don't know if this is in my notes or not. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But it's just my little personal pet peeve. I just got to get off my chest right quick. One thing that I can't stand is what I call the de-Christianization of Black history. The de-Christianization of Black history. I mean, the fact of the matter is, y'all know what it is, man. In the public school system, maybe it's gotten better now, but during Black History Month, I mean, of course, you're going to get like Harriet Tubman. You're going to get, of course, Martin Luther King. If somebody's going above and beyond, they might hit you with like a Garrett Morgan or Benjamin Banneker or something like that. But that's like, extra, But with that being said, is that one thing that I didn't get growing up is understanding how these people's Christian faith, played into what they did for our community and why they were fighting for freedom so vigorously. So, for example, we think about Frederick Douglass, right? We know about him as being an abolitionist, but most people don't know that he was also a preacher. He was a lay preacher in his church, right? Frederick Douglass, as a matter of fact, his publication, the North Star, which was his main, the pinnacle of his abolitionist work, right? It was a newspaper called the North Star. He published the North Star out of the basement of an AME church where he taught at, right? As a matter of fact, in his memoirs, there's this one scene where they're talking about where he expressed he wanted to start what they call a Sabbath school. He wanted to teach the Bible in a Sabbath school. And unfortunately, the Caucasians in the area came together and said, look, bruh, unless you want to catch 2 bullets in your chest like Christopher Adams did, we suggest you not start that school. He was actually threatened with it. His life was actually threatened for wanting to preach the Bible. That's the kind of stuff you never hear about, in our public school system. So again, like I said, it's that de-Christianization of Black history. I mean, there's more I could say about that. Maybe we'll come back to it. With that said, let me get to a clear-cut example. Okay, I already got it up there. Clear-cut example of abolitionists incorporating biblical concepts to fight for freedom. This is actually from Reverend Leonard Black. He was a former enslaved person. He escaped slavery, and then he goes on to be a powerful abolitionist. In his memoirs, he says this. He says, quote, "Is man to be considered a mere ox, to be bowled up and stall-fed? Has he not a mind capable of rising higher and higher in all that is expansive, pure, and holy? Has he not within him a spark of pure divinity, which, when he is surrounded by high and ennobling influences, is fanned into a light so bright as to lead us to respond to the glorious truth man is indeed made in the image of God? Do you talk of selling a man? You might as well speak of selling immortality or sunshine." End quote. It's kind of got some bars there at the end, but with the sunshine, I like that. But what I want to draw attention to is that his mentioning of man being made in the image of God, right? So we have to understand, again, this was an assault on personhood. What I call slavery, I refer to as that dismemberment of the soul, separating persons from personhood, right? And so what you have is this notion of us all being made in the image of God being like the foundation from which, or maybe like the moral currency, if you will, that abolitionists employed in order to argue their case to the broader society, right? So that's what you see them. And there's several other examples I could give. Actually, I have a whole presentation on the image of God and the Black experience and how you see this theme flowing throughout the majority of our history. So, coming full circle here, there's no doubt that there are professing Christians that have, stood on the wrong side of the race question. I'm not trying to, paint as if nobody did wrong, right? However, my whole point is that our story doesn't begin or end there. We have a terrible problem in the African community of starting everything with with the cotton fields. It's not like we just appeared one day picking cotton in the fields, and that's all there is to say about our history. And we really have to help people get out of that. But historically, it's a fact that Christianity has been in Africa for about 2,000 years now, with about 1,500 of that coming before the transatlantic slave trade. And here in America, as African Americans pushed toward freedom and equality, they found a bedrock of personhood and liberty through the biblical worldview in such a way that they were able to fight internalized oppression, and also challenge the moral systems that stood before them through public resistance. Right? We can go even further with that. But to say that, to kind of wrap it up. Oh, okay, I won't get there too fast. It's because of historical evidence like what I've just laid out so far that we can claim that the first of my two major claims is sustainable. That Christians, African Christians today, we stand on the shoulders of giants, 2,000 years of giants, as a matter of fact, such that we have these historical connecting points where we don't have to have this sense that Christianity is foreign to our African heritage. All right, there we go. Now we got to get to some of the tougher stuff. How am I doing on time? Doing all right? Okay. 5 minutes? 15. Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, we good. We good. So that's 15. Is that a Baptist 15, or is that a 15? That's how I clarify, right? All right. So actually, what I think I'm going to do is, because this might take me a little further than the 15, I'm going to kind of give a condensed version of this next point. So everybody know white Jesus. You know what I'm saying? Like, who man's is this? I don't know this dude. I don't know who that is. But I want to briefly turn our attention to a set of historical realities that I think has become a monkey wrench for many in our community, and it's kind of just difficult to really overstate it. So I want to take some time with that. Many folks look at like artworks like this, the white Jesus stuff, and they want to address it, but most of the time we don't really dig deep and really understanding what the problem is here. So I want to kind of describe the problem and give a historical / philosophical argument to kind of counteract why people are making this claim about Christianity being the white man's religion. Is that all right? See if we can do that in 15 minutes. We'll find out. So let's see. Before we go further, I want to make, for this next section, I want to make sure that makes a real crucial distinction between Christianity and the church. This is a real important distinction that we have to make in order for the rest of this to make sense. So when I'm referring to Christianity, I'm talking about the worldview that centers around the life and teachings of Jesus, to put it simplistically. All right, when I talk about the church, I'm talking about people professing to be Christians, whether individually or as a collective. Okay, so I want to make sure we keep that distinction in mind because I'll be using those two terms in very specific ways. All right, we with that? We good? Okay. Okay, so to really understand how white Jesus came to be a problem, we have to understand three historical realities and their relationship to one another. All right, it's Christendom, pagan lands, and racism. Christendom, pagan lands, and racism. You can shorten it CPR. It's kind of the acronym there. All right. Actually, I talked about it this morning a little bit. With Hebrews 12:1, we're instructed to lay aside the weights and the sins that so easily beset us. So I'm going to be arguing that Christendom, pagan lands, and racism are like those three weights that have been picked up over time. Okay. All right. So the first of the three weights we're going to talk about is Christendom, and it has to do with instances where the church is blending earthly powers and culture at the expense of transcending earthly powers and culture. All right, blending rather than transcending. For the sake of time, just make sure I move through it quickly. I'm going to be sticking pretty tight to my notes, so just forgive me for that. So in the first few centuries of church history, you have like this back and forth dynamic between the church community and we'll just say the government, Roman government. Sometimes you have Christians are looked at as just being kind of a despised group that just nobody wants around. And then other times it's just really worse, where it's not just that, but it's severe persecution. So there's kind of like an ebb and flow back and forth between those two peaks and valleys, if you will. But something definitive changes in 313 AD when Constantine issues the Edict of Milan. Somebody say the Edict of Milan. Yeah, the Edict of Milan, okay, in 313 AD. So the Edict of Milan made it the law of the land that all religions, Christianity included, were to be tolerated in Rome, right? But of course, this is only the beginning, because in 325 AD, just 12, however many years later, my math is terrible, whatever that is, just about a decade later, Constantine weighs in on the Council of Nicaea, right? So you have this intermingling between the church and the Roman government, right? As a matter of fact, with the exception of maybe 2 emperors, I want to say every emperor after Constantine professes to be a Christian, before until the fall of Rome. So, unfortunately, you have this joining of arms between Roman imperial power and church authority or influence. Constantine goes around, he's appointing bishops and assigning the church to do this or that and weigh in on, governmental issues, and just the lines get really blurred, right? However, this kind of translated into Christianity becoming more culturally acceptable. So now Christianity is no longer like these folks like on the outs, right? But they're in some sense more culturally acceptable than they had been during those kind of persecution times, right? Now, St. Augustine that we talked about earlier, St. Augustine of North Africa, coming along just one generation or so after this shift between the world and the church, Augustine writes a work called City of God, right? Now, basically, Augustine argues that in the earth realm, you've got the city of God, which is God's people, His kingdom, and the outworkings of His kingdom, and then you have the city of man, which would be like the government, the natural aspect, of this world, right? And his argument is that we're kind of like between the two of them, they're kind of like roommates that can't stand each other, but they can't get out of a lease, and so they gotta have to put up with each other for a time being. It's kind of how he depicts it a little bit, right? And so the best way for both the city of man and the city of God to coexist in the earth is to make sure that you keep the boundaries clear, and that and just know each other's roles and don't get in each other's lanes. That's kind of how Augustine argues in the city of God. Okay. Now fast forward into the Middle Ages, in which Western Europe is beginning to kind of take shape. Christianity began to spread through missionaries, right? And this is going to be kind of weaving a couple things together here, right? So it was already spreading through missionaries and making some progress, but it receives a major boost in Western Europe due to the efforts of a guy named Charlemagne. All right, somebody say Charlemagne. Okay, now I'm talking about Charlemagne on the radio show, obviously. The original Charlemagne. In 771 AD, Charlemagne comes to power as king of an ethnic group called the Franks, right? And his biographer reports that Charlemagne is raised in a Christianized and very powerful family. So his father before him brings about Christianity in his territory, and so Charlemagne wants to take up the mantle and protecting the church, spreading Christianity through his reign, and so on, right? Unfortunately, his ambitions to so-called protect the church are running parallel alongside his ambitions to rule over all the Western world. Now, interestingly enough, Charlemagne actually reportedly slept with a copy of City of God, Augustine's work, on his bedside. But as we'll see, Charlemagne didn't quite follow Augustine's advice, unfortunately, right? So Charlemagne he's a very successful sort of like warrior king, and he goes on to conquer the majority of Western Europe. I'm actually shortening some of this, but he goes on to conquer the majority of Western Europe. Let me skip ahead here. Yeah, and in the process, he's conquering like different pagan, European pagans. So for example, he has this war with a group called the Saxons, right? And when he wins that war, again, he's kind of got this unhealthy blending of his role as king and the church. So what he actually does is he takes the defeated Saxons, the one that survived, and he had them march through this river while some of the priests were pronouncing some Latin formula over them. That was supposed to have been their baptism and conversion. It's obviously not legit at all. But that was kind of how he had this twisted view of blending, conquering with the sword and conquering for Christ. And he had it all twisted, right? Now, with that being said, Charlemagne decides that he wants to have Christian law to be the law of the land in all of his under his reign. And so just like you have, say, state law, right? Everybody can kind of do their own thing with respect to state law. He instituted Christian law as like federal law, something that applied to everybody under his administration, so to speak, right? But with that being said, it's like, well, look, everybody can't follow this Christian law unless they understand it. And so we got to teach people what the law is, or else they can't follow it. And so he actually co-opts the church. He decides to appoint missionaries, monks, and different Christian theologians that were still around at the time, and commissions them to teach this Christian law and also teach education more generally. So his thinking was, we can't just have a bunch of ignorant people running around, so we got to teach them, basically. And I'm going to use the church to do so, right? Now, with that being said, he still has in mind old Rome as being like the template for a great civilization. And so he's commissioning the church to pretty much teach Roman literature, some of the Greek literature that they still had at the time, and basically, a lot of secular, information, right? So the church is no longer just fulfilling the Great Commission that Jesus assigned them to, but now they got this commission of Charlemagne, getting in the way as well, all right? Now, essentially, this is how Christianity becomes woven into the fabric of Western European society. Because, like I said, Charlemagne takes over the vast majority of Europe, and you have under his reign this growing of Christian thought, so to speak. So that's kind of how Christianity and Europe kind of become intermingled, where they're considered to be one and the same package. All right, does that make sense so far? Oh, yeah, I can get the question in just a second. I'm gonna finish up here in a minute, and I think we'll have about 45 minutes for questions. All right, so moving really quickly. You also have this notion of pagan lands. Okay, so now you've got under Charlemagne, you got Western Europe. You know what I'm saying, in terms of the nations that have been so-called Christianized, as being like Christendom. That's the term, the Christen. That's what they meant by Christendom, right? And so the idea back then was like, okay, you got Christendom, you got Muslim lands, and you have pagan lands. Okay. Now, Muslim lands, they kind of had some respect for because they had been battling the Muslims for centuries, and so there was like this competitive respect in a sense. So they're like slightly lesser civilized, than Christendom. But then you have these other regions that they refer to as pagan lands, like the place where our people was at, And in those places, they were considered to be, have no souls, to be basically savages. And so personhood was associated with, basically where you lived and what your people believed at the time, right? And so according to Catholic tradition, Catholic papal bull, let me see, make sure I have it right here. So on June 18th, 1452, Pope Nicholas V issued, I'm sure I'm going to mispronounce it, but it's called Dum Diversis, right? And so basically he says that if you're in pagan lands, you're just, pretty much worthless. We just do whatever we want to do. We can invade your lands, enslave you, and all that sort of thing. He actually issues that order to King Alfonso, right? And so again, you have this unhealthy relationship between the church and the world. We've got Christendom. Piggybacking on that, you have this notion that if you're living in pagan lands, you've got lesser personhood and value. And then you have this other landmark change that happens in Europe, okay? It's called the Age of Enlightenment, right? The Enlightenment period, okay? Now, during this period, what you have is that individuals were pretty much breaking away from tradition and, divine revelations as means for understanding the world, right? And so you have folks, breaking away from the church. They're no longer using spiritual categories to understand what's going on in the world. So this notion that people are to be ranked based upon their creed, what they believed, or whether they're a pagan or not, kind of gets thrown out the window. I'm saying, or maybe I should say, given a new paint job, where they replace that with, what they call this more natural perspective. We're not going to rank people based upon, what they believe. We're going to rank them based upon race, right? So you have this guy named Charles Linnaeus who's basically categorizing people and saying, based upon your skin color, bone structure, things like that, you're either going to be, further up or further down on the totem pole of human evolution or what have you, right? And obviously, unfortunately, we found ourselves on the bottom, whereas Europe, they placed themselves, at the top. And so now people are no longer, people are not being understood based upon being made in the image of God. They're being measured as to how they weigh up to, the image of European man. You know what I'm saying? So they were just obviously way off base. Now, moving quickly, so you've got Christendom, pagan lands, and racism, right? None of these concepts flow from the biblical worldview, right? Not one of them, right? So we can make a couple arguments here. First of all, you might want to take notes on this one. We can come back to, maybe this is what you had a question about, I'm not sure. But, there's two errors that people are making when they make these kinds of claims of Christianity being the white man's religion based upon the Christendom, pagan lands, and the system that flows out of it, right, of oppression and so on and so forth. First of all, you have the conflation fallacy. You know what I'm saying? The conflation fallacy is a logical error, of treating two distinct concepts as if they were the same, right? So Christianity and the church are two very different things. So just because somebody is making claims about the church did this, the church did that, I mean, sure, yeah, the church did a lot of bad stuff. But just to say something about what the church has done doesn't necessarily condemn Christianity itself, right? There's two different things. And so when people treat them like they've committed a logical error called the conflation fallacy. Also, right? That'll make sense in a minute. So also we could talk about the law of identity. Somebody say law of identity. Okay. So in philosophy or critical thinking, you have what's like generally speaking, you have three basic laws of logic. Okay. Now, the laws of logic are kind of like ground rules for coming to right conclusions about things, if you will. Now, the law of identity is that everything is identical to itself, right? Or if there's something about A that's different than B, then we know that A and B are not the same, right? So just real quick, let's say, for example, really we use the logical laws all the time. So that's why I don't think this. I think you guys will be right in tune where I'm at in just a second. So let's say that you meet me for the first time, and you're asking me about my family. Like, yeah, I'm been married to my wife for about 10 years. She's about 5'7". Chocolate sister from North Side, Richmond or whatever. And so I'm talking about my wife, right? And then maybe a week later, you see me hugged up in the movies with some 6'5" blonde chick. You know what I'm saying? You know that something's wrong, right? That's not who I describe. That's why you give me one of these looks right here. You give me the side eye, because there's something about who I described as being my wife that's different about who I'm hugged up with, right? And then, after that, I'd be in one of these because my wife would kill me. It'd be a wrap, But that's the law of identity. If there's something that's wrong, if there's something about A that's different than B, then we know that A and B are not the same. Okay. So real quick, if we know that when it comes to this so-called white man's religion, if this concept of Christendom is not a part of the Christian faith, it can't be linked to Jesus' teaching, or this notion that people can be ranked based upon personhood. And so, based upon where they live and what they believe, and that determines their value. That's not a part of the biblical worldview. Or when it comes to racism, obviously racism is not a part of the biblical worldview. We can work through that. As a matter of fact, in Genesis 1, 26 and 27, we see the basis of value, right? We're made in the image of God. That's the foundation of who we are. So any notion of discriminating against people or abusing them based upon what they believe or their race, it obviously doesn't flow from the biblical worldview. So that may be a part of what produced the so-called white man's religion and white Jesus pictures and all that kind of stuff. But if there's something about what people are referring to as the white man's religion that's different than Christianity itself, then we can conclude that Christianity itself and the white man's religion are not the same. And so when I think about all the folks that we talked about, the 2,000 years or so of African history, those shoulders that we stand on and what they held to, they didn't hold to the white man's religion, nor do I today, right? We can be confident that we have this ancient faith, that there are these connecting points, right? And it's not the case that Christianity itself, in a sense, undermines personal value in the way that this other thing, white man's religion, does. They own some other stuff with that. And so with that said, I know I'm over my time a little bit, so I want to make sure I kind of pause there, and I guess we can start taking questions. Y'all like my little picture here, my little comedy piece?
All right. Well, can we give our brother Adam a hand?
Oh, man.
All right. Awesome. Hopefully you all enjoyed the, I guess it's kind of like an onslaught of information.
It's a buffet. Yeah, it's a buffet of information.
Yeah, a buffet. So we're going to begin our question and answer period here in just a moment. For those who may have came in late, I'm just going to kind of go over what we talked about in the beginning while we set up here, while we transition. But for our Q&A period, of course, you'll be able to ask your questions. And the way we're going to kind of roll with the questions is Adam and myself are going to be the ones that field the questions and provide responses. I just want to say that, of course, with this discourse, we're not claiming to be, experts on the on the subject. When we've reached the limit of our knowledge, we'll most humbly say, I don't know. That's a good question. I have to get back to you, or maybe we can discuss that, at a later date, and we have some more information for you. But we're just here to give some good, thorough responses to you all. Of course, when you came in, everyone should have gotten a sheet that had the what we're calling rules of engagement, and so with that, it just kind of sets the tone for how we're going to be doing our question and answer period here today. And just ask that everyone abide by those rules to kind of help this flow smoothly. Is that cool? Yeah, no rushing the stage. In addition to that, with asking your questions rather, when you go ahead and you come up to the microphone, of course the microphone is there in the center of the room. That's how we'll be taking the questions. And of course, one person at a time. If you want to form a line, that's perfectly fine. But we ask that you just try and keep your questions or your remarks to about maybe 30 seconds or less, so that if there are other questions in the room and as other questions come in online, everyone has an opportunity to be able to ask those questions. All right. So with that being said, we got one person at the mic here. Go ahead and, of course, just tell us your name, because, Adam doesn't really know anybody here. But you go ahead.
My name is Stu, and first of all, I want to say welcome to Omaha.
Cool, thank you.
I lived in Virginia for a while. The people out there were really good to me, so I want to welcome you to my hometown.
Cool.
I'm what you call one of those black atheists. And my first question for you is, you identified Christianity, the worldview, and Christians, the people. What is the name that you give for the billion-dollar global entity that governs and determines political policy for the people who fall under that worldview?
Yeah, can you clarify that? Like, I'm not exactly sure what you mean.
Sure. There's like for instance, you have like the Catholic Church, you have the Protestant denominations and stuff like that, and neither of those denominations would include those entities. For the sake of the conversation, what is the word that you use for those entities? Because they clearly exist, and they're clearly a part of the conversation. Neither of those definitions would include them, so how do we refer to them in this dialogue?
Well, I guess, I think I would say that they would be included under how I define the church. I mean, if I'm talking about, because you can't have those organizations without people. You know what I'm saying? Now, if you would say, I guess we could talk about maybe social constructs, this notion of there being like a denomination. You know what I'm saying? That's not a entity unto itself. I mean, it's a group of people who define themselves a certain way. So, I mean, whether it be the Catholic Church, now some people would disagree with me on this, but I would define somebody who's in a Catholic church and has a legitimate profession of faith. I would define them as being a Christian and therefore under the church. I'm sorry, was that? Well, yeah. So now this gets into you can go a couple different ways with it. So you have, from a New Testament standpoint, you have this term like the ecclesia, right? And the ecclesia is essentially the church. I mean, it's the body of believers, right? So that's a real collective, if you will. You know what I'm saying? So maybe that might be a word that might be relatable, just the term collective or something like that. And sometimes these collectives operate in such a way that they pool their resources and have similar agendas, but underpinning the type of organization that you're talking about, I would see it as being like a collective, Yeah. It's a fair question, yeah.
My name is Nathan Pierce. I identify myself as an Arcerian. An Arcerian was the one who believes in the ancient traditions of Africans. And I find several disconnects in what I heard. The first disconnect that I found was that you referenced the African diaspora as 3,000 years. Is that correct?
No, I don't think I did. I wouldn't say that it was 3,000 years.
When you were speaking of the European section and then the Muslim section and then the African section, I thought I heard, well, be that as it may, I come from the perspective of my ancestors, and they identify themselves as Akhenatans. An Akhenaten is a person who was original from that place. When you reference Constantine was a person who he did not conform to the religions of his time. He adapted it for the sake of saving Rome, because at the time Rome was in a war between the East and West Empire. Mm-hmm. In that war, they were losing. Constantine claimed to have looked up at the sun and seen
a cross.
He identified it as a cross, but they were rays. He identified that he saw the rays, and that led him to Christendom. That led him to believe that that was the sign from his God that he was right and he had the ability to overthrow and unite the Roman Empire. Is that correct so far? Would you agree?
Well, I mean, I don't want to impose it as far as motivations, because you could argue too that his mom was supposedly a Christian. So when you say that it was for that reason, the symbol that he became Christian, I mean, there's more that we could flesh that out. But I mean,
okay.
If you want to go ahead.
Okay, now that is recorded, so it does have parameters. It has limitations, and I like to recite the Assyrian concept where it has its creator as Amen, which we happen to say at the end of all of our prayers. And in it, after Amen, it has Arse and Arset. And Arse and Arset, if we trace that out, we'll find that that is the beginning and the traces of the concept of Jesus the Christ and Mary.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry. I'll let you finish.
And
yeah.
that's because when you reference Augustine, who studied at the Temple of Alexandria in Egypt, it's where all the elite people came to study. This is documented throughout history as well, because anything I say can be, if one researches it, it could be proven true. And so when they destroyed the Library of Alexandria, they were able to take the consciousness, the black consciousness, and put it in Europe. When I say put it in Europe, what I'm saying is that they didn't have the Christian consciousness. They were, for lack of a better word, pagans. And the definition of pagan is someone who lives outside of the city. That is the academic definition.
No, not necessarily. I mean, but I guess I kind of want to. I'm trying to. If you can help me to kind of get to the objection that you're making, I'm trying to find where you.
The objection that I'm making is one that when you skip a broad part, those things were very important and dynamic, and such as the time between Constantine, the time between Charlemagne. You didn't identify that Charlemagne, he didn't send out missionaries. He sent out soldiers. And it was, for those who took history, it was like that 100 Years' War, those wars where they were going out and they were trying to get people to submit to Christianity.
Well, can I come back on that, though? Because so I think where we would agree is that what you don't want to do is like flatten out history in a sense. Like we want to make sure we're taking a robust understanding of the facts as they are. So to your point about him not sending out missionaries, I just feel like you're kind of thinning out what, Charlemagne's approach. I mean, it wasn't just that he sent out soldiers. So for example, you have a gentleman named Alcuin, Alcuin. Now Alcuin was, for all intents and purposes, he was a Christian theologian, and he was the guy who was kind of like the among like another four. There was like a think tank, like a Christian think tank, who were basically behind this program of like what I talked about with Christian law and education and so forth, as commissioned by Charlemagne. And so yeah, Charlemagne was very much so involved in commissioning the church to fulfill that educational role. So when you say that he just sent soldiers, I mean, I see that as being like a flattening of history in the same sense that you're saying that I'm doing it. Now, also you made a couple other claims as well, and sometimes it's just difficult to disagree with folks in ways that doesn't sound inflammatory, but I'll just have to trust that you know that I don't mean anything by it. But this notion that, well, wait, let me just say this. I mean, this notion that that Jesus and Mary and so forth are derived from or copycats of Asar, Aset, and Haru. I mean, to be honest with you, just the weight of scholarship is against you on that. I mean, the fact of the matter.
No, it's not.
Okay, I mean, you can look it up. I mean, that's fine.
I have.
So have I. So I'm going to give you why. I'm going to tell you why. Here's a perfect example.
Okay.
So when you think about the concept of Haru, right?
Yes.
So am I correct in saying that he would have been, the child of Asar and Aset? Would you agree with that?
Define child, because it's a principle. It's not a child. See, that's the disconnect.
Well,
But
see, now the disconnect is if you're going to say that he's not, a child of the two, you're going to say he's just a principle, well, you're going to be disconnected from Egyptians as they actually practice their system.
So
if you're going to say that it's just a principle, then already you've adopted a more modernized version of their belief system than what they would have practiced. But be that as it may, either way you want to go, the reality is, even if let's just call it a principle, you know what I'm saying? Like Haru is in some sense derivative from Asar and Aset.
correct.
Now, Jesus is not derivative in the sense that he did not exist and then now he does. He's the second member of the Trinity, is co-eternal with the Father and the Holy Spirit. And so what happens is often, and I don't mean this disrespectfully, but what happens
Well, you're
is
not disrespecting me. Like I said, this is academic. This is not personal.
okay, good. So what happens is often individuals who make the argument that you're making, they'll point out what they believe to be a similarity, but they leave out all the dissimilarities. I'm saying, say, oh, well, look, they got this from that.
Let me
And that's
interject
called,
because
let me just give one more line out. That's for my philosophy heads out there, that's called the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, where you say, well, because this came before that, then therefore that came from this. That's just logically fallacious. And again, I say that with all respect. But, the textual evidence is against you on that one, though.
Well, I disagree, and this is why I disagree. Because the creator of Western civilization was Greece. Am I correct? Greece is the founder.
The creator of Western civilization?
Yeah, they created Western civilization.
Well,
Greece
I mean, again,
created Western civilization.
but again, so
That's
I would say
true.
I would say that you're making the same type of thinning out of
No,
history,
yes.
because like where were the
Is
Greeks?
that yes
Where were
or
the Greeks
no?
before then, though? Or was there anybody? So again, we say they created Western civilization.
Exactly.
Actually, Western civilization, if you want to be real about it, flows from a number of different streams. And so, for example, okay, I mean, you can shake your head, no, but I mean, we could talk.
Because Western civilization derives from Greece.
Talking to the mic, please, because you were streaming.
Western civilization derived from Greece. I mean, anyone who's taken ancient history understands that Greece was Athens was a trading post of Egypt under Thutmose III, 18th dynasty. That's true. Not only Athens was a trading post, but so was Troy. That's academically true. It's not something that I said. It's something that anyone in here can research and find out. Now, Greece was the first one to rise because of its relationship with the Semitic people. Semitic people are people who are African plus mixed with other areas that are Asians, whites, whatever. That is the concept of a Semitic person. So, and that can be found out by anyone pulling up Semitism and looking in the dictionary for the definition of Semitism. So that means that those black people who came up out of there and went around and conquered that area, who are identified as Etruscans. This also can be verified by looking up. This is not something that I'm putting out here because I'm trying to distort. What I'm trying to do is bring some factuality. When the Greeks came in and studied in the Egyptian temples, this is also academically verifiable. The Greeks came in and studied under the Egyptians. They were called neophytes.
Oh, okay, can I just butt in right quick? So
Let me. I don't want to cut off you all's dialogue, and I see y'all are going back and forth. But we talked about a time limit earlier, and you said a lot of good things.
But
and
I'm gonna say this, and then I'm gonna sit down.
Oh, okay.
I'm gonna say this,
All
and
right.
I'm gonna sit down.
As you wrap
Okay.
it up, you can come back up. But I wanna
Okay,
get to some other
no
questions.
problem. No problem. Under the Greeks, they created Hercules. Hercules was the son of God. He was the son of the Greek god. And in the north, they created Thor, the son of the Norwegian god. And in the area that is non-identified as Christendom, they created Jesus Christ. All of these individuals that they created, all of them are identified as the Son of Man. All of them don't have an earthly father.
oh, that's
Let me
false. It's not true that they're all identified as the Son of Man. As a matter of fact, the Son of Man is a very specific messianic phrase that flows from the Judaic tradition. So that's what I'm saying. So I mean, while I appreciate,
Wait a minute.
I cut you off. Go ahead.
Yeah, Judaism is also a tradition from the Africans. That's why Moses is said that he was taught in the ways of the Egyptians. So when we go through this,
but again, so. Again, with all maybe I don't have to keep saying it, but I respect you in terms of where you're coming from. But the problem is, like, when you make statements like you take one verse of Moses was schooled in all the ways of the Egyptians. Of course he was. But then when you look at the first 5 books of Moses, right? I mean, there's so many, let's just say, polemical devices throughout those books that directly contradict, or I'll say just what's the word I'm looking for, or like counter arguments to Kemetic theology. So, I mean, you can go from Genesis chapter 1, talking about, comparing the concept of the noon to what you see with the waters and so forth. There's a lot of different directions you go there, but it's just not historically responsible to just take that one verse and then try to pin, Judaism with the entirety of like weigh it down with Egyptian theology.
Okay, I'm gonna state that we're gonna end this right here because we got another question. We appreciate you. I do appreciate you coming to the mic. Next, of course, say your names for Brother Adam here.
Thank you for not running up on the stage and punching me in the face. We're staying within the rules. We appreciate it. Thank you. So do I. Yeah, it's good.
All right. Okay. Thank you, sir.
Right.
Appreciate
we
you.
We don't want to. Okay.
Appreciate you.
Dwayne Hawkins, Omaha native.
Okay.
Northwest Husky.
All right. I represent. All right. Yeah, Eagles fan. Is that you talking about Philly here? What are we talking about?
High schools. These are high schools.
Oh man, y'all going deeper than that. Okay, cool. Runs deep.
So the difference between Christianity and the white man's religion, you were pointing out right toward the end, and it just caused me to think about the evolution of the white man's religion. Would you conclude, or would you agree that it evolves over time and it has a strong political expression today? And how can Christians be bold in their witness in separating the current version of the white man's religion with the constants of Christianity?
Great question. So, so you're right. So what I tried to illustrate is that there has been a progression of different features of what people are referring to as white man's religion. It picks up these different features over time, and it's kind of snowballed into like this bigger, culturally oppressive phenomenon, if you will. So yes, I do think that it has evolved over time, but then I think there's certain themes, if you will, that have been constant, underlying. So I want to go back to, for a second to Augustine, where I was talking about the city of God, how he sketches out there's this notion that there's this fine line between the city of God and the city of man, right? And that you have to be careful to keep those lines distinct. You know what I'm saying? It's not to say that there won't be interaction between the two cities, if you will, but they need to maintain their own character, so to speak, each individually. So he's dealing with that problem back in your late 4th century. You know what I'm saying? Because he's dealing with Constantine and telling the church, like, look, it's cool that we're not getting killed every day, but y'all, we need to make sure that we're maintaining who we are and not letting the world infiltrate the church. That's kind of where he was coming from. Now fast forward up to today, I have no problem with saying that you still have that same problem going on where just quite frankly, you have some people who believe that, say, secular conservatism or the Republican Party is like the Christian extension of, into politics or something like that. And that's the same kind of muddying of the waters between the church and the world today that was going on when Augustine was writing City of God. And so we do have to be careful to keep those lines distinct. And so one way I look at it is I think that Christians really need to be Christians. Like, if we have this awareness, then it is our duty, to speak up when we see that blurring of the lines and be like, hey, brother, whether you like it or not, this is where you're crossing that line and not, you're kind of crossing the line between, it's like the scripture says, we're in the world but not of it. You know what I'm saying? We ought to be calling one another out on those kinds of things such that, we're not blurring those lines. And if we don't, then we leave ourselves open to the same criticisms of the generations that have come before. So that's why, I'm just going to be explicit. That's why, when certain individuals look at somebody like a Donald Trump and they see some of the things he does and says or whatever, and they see Christians just ride or die, no matter what he does or says, they're going to rock with it and never have a word to say otherwise. It's that blurring of the lines such that it leaves us open to critique that where we otherwise shouldn't be. So does that kind of maybe address your question?
It does. And then lastly, to what extent do you think this white man's religion that's distinct from Christianity is fueled by power.
Oh well, yeah. I mean, I don't know. Maybe almost entirely. Maybe. I mean, because you have to understand that the concept of race as being used as a tool to categorize other people is inherently related to power. It has to do with who has rights, who has wealth, who is able to do this, that, and the third, who's able to accrue wealth through, from generation to generation. This concept of race has always been tied to, in terms of how it works out in society, has always been tied to power, wealth, and so forth. And so yeah, I mean, I would say anybody who participates in this heinous, false caricature of Christianity that people call the white man's religion, anybody who's participating in that, more than likely, either they are engaging in it, in some way connected with that power dynamic, or perhaps they're maybe ignorant of it. But I don't think that you can really understand what this other entity is, the white man's religion, without understanding the role that power plays in having produced and perpetuated it. So yeah, and as Christians, we ought to, when we see it, we ought to be standing firm against it. A couple of months ago, I was in Atlanta. I'll just share this really quickly. But I was just talking about the role of the black church specifically. You know what I'm saying? If people remember going back into the Bible, you're still in the church, right? So I can refer to the Bible, right? You have this account where you have the prophet Nathan. You know what I'm saying? He comes into King David. David has slept with Bathsheba, got Uriah killed, and Nathan calls him out in front of the royal court. You know what I'm saying? That was his role as a prophet, was to do that, right? Throughout American history, at least, I say just history of the Western world, the black church has often played that Nathan ministry kind of role. You know what I'm saying, of confronting power. I mean, again, going back to, we could talk about David Walker, you know what I'm saying, who was published, I believe, the first abolitionist pamphlet from an African American anyway. Frederick Douglass, again, some of the guys I named, Martin Delany, Otto Cato. There's a number of different people where you have folks out of the black church holding these, speaking to power and holding them accountable and say, hey, look, this isn't cool. Here's what true biblical Christianity looks like. This is what y'all doing, this, and therefore we oppose it. I think there's still room for that sort of critique today. Yeah.
All right, well, we had a few questions / comments that came in online that
cool. All right.
that I'll share. So one of the comments, one of the comments was a question, but it was a little odd, but it was odd the way they phrased it. So, of course, some of the comments and questions that we got prior to the event were revolving around this central question of why is this even a question? Like, is Christianity the white man's religion? And I'm gonna let Adam respond here. But one of the reasons why, well, first off, let me say this. So this question is primarily a question that is asked here in the western part of the world. That it's a question that's primarily being raised, or an objection that is primarily raised in places like America, Europe, and Canada. That if you go to certain countries in Africa, or you go to even places in Asia, they're not asking this question. If they are, it's in small pockets. Like, it's primarily asked and raised by individuals here in the western part of the world, and it's raised in light of the condition and the plight and the suffering that individuals, persons of African descent, ADOS, however you want to say it, the condition in which we live, right? Our existential reality, that we live in a country that is based upon and predicated upon this propagation of the social construct of race, right? As one sister said, she said, yes, race is just a social construct, but I'm still black. It was Nefertiti that said that. Shout out to Nefertiti if she's watching. Actually, she was on earlier. But
Okay, cool.
the whole it's this whole addressing this whole issue, right? That when we ask the question, when the question is asked, is Christianity the white man's religion? It's almost in brackets. Is Christianity, brackets, in America or in the Western world, the white man's religion? And so one of the things that is done by apologists like Adam is that there is this going back to early Christian history, church history, etc., to show that, number one, Christianity biblically is not to be conflated with Christianity that we talk about here in the West, in the sense that it's about power, it's about oppressing others, etc., so on and so forth. But so one is to show the fidelity of what Christianity truly is as it pertains to the scriptures. But then there's also, particularly when you take kind of a historical approach as Adam has done, and you get to American church history, where that's where we begin to see a lot of, as he has said, like this muddying of the waters, where that's where a lot of the how do I say, the tough nails, the bare knuckle apologetics and the responses and the conversations really begin. Because a lot of individuals, honestly, I mean, due to a lack of education, or due to the poor education system we have here in the West, have no idea about the African influence and shaping of Christianity, right? So that's why that's important to bring up, number one. But then two, and Adam, and this is where I kind of want you to speak to. So just share, why is this one a relevant question that individuals are asking, an objection that people are raising? Why is that we one should take it seriously? Because there are those Christians who would try to dismiss the question and say, well, here you go with that, race baiting stuff, or you dragging race into the church kind of thing. So how would you address kind of the reason why this question is being asked, kind of the different sides and views that people have with respect to this kind of question? Because I mean, we had some people who kind of came in late, but just kind of give us some response to that.
Yeah, sure. So there's a couple of different directions we could go with it. First, I want to start with the scriptures, right? That, as Paul talks about, we ought to not be ignorant of the enemy's devices, right? He talks about that. Now, the sad reality, look, to be honest with you, I wish I didn't have to answer this question. I really wished I didn't have to go around doing seminars and spending time on podcasts dealing with this question, because it means it's really a testament to how a segment of the church has shortchanged the gospel, quite frankly. You know what I'm saying? I wish it wasn't the case that, just to be explicit, I wish it wasn't the case that there weren't professing white folks out here enslaving Africans. I wish that wasn't the case. You know what I'm saying? But historically, it's a reality. I'm saying some people who profess Christianity did some really bad things. I'm saying, and as a result, just from a historical standpoint, when people look back at those bad things, it puts a bad taste in their mouth with respect to Christianity. That they maybe don't take the time to think through the kinds of distinctions that I spoke about. But we can't just ignore it. I mean, look, my mission is very simple. Number one, I care about souls. That's what I care about. I want you to know Christ. I want you to, abide with him from now to eternity. It's really that simple. That's why I'm here. That's what I do what I do. And if there's a stumbling block that's keeping people from doing that, I'm going to address it. It just so happens that this notion of the white man's religion is one of those kinds of stumbling blocks. Now, let me take a step back for a second. I don't know the person who asked the question, but just throw a little philosophy at it if I could. Generally speaking, this is just something that I think we can all maybe think about, is that generally when you're engaging in apologetics, defending the faith, right, you're going to run into two broad categories of objections. You have what's called de facto objections and de jure objections. Okay, now de facto objections would be somebody like saying that Jesus didn't rise from the dead. They're saying that it's factually untrue, that something about Christianity is just false. That's a de facto objection, or God doesn't exist. That would be like a de facto objection. Okay, whether Christianity is true or false. De jure is not so much about whether Christianity is true or false, but it's about this. It's when people make claims that there's some aspect of Christianity that is so abhorrent or so horrible and heinous that it ought to be rejected on those grounds, right? And so that's what people are saying when they make the claim about Christianity being the white man's religion, is that there's something about Christianity that's so horrible and heinous that that's all that needs to be said about why I'm rejecting it. I'm saying that's what you call a de jure objection. You know what I'm saying? So philosophically speaking, when people ask that question about, why are we even dealing with it, they're telling me that they're probably not really engaging people with the gospel on these issues, number one. And I don't mean that to be mean, I'm saying, but that's probably the case. And then two, they haven't really thought about a deeper story as to why people are asking the question. People are hurting, man. I mean, this isn't the only important question, but just because you're not interested in it, or just because it doesn't resonate with you, doesn't mean that just as a matter of Christian obligation, if you see somebody struggling with it such that they're rejecting the gospel, then it would behoove you to do something about it, one way or the other. You know what I'm saying? So I guess from philosophical grounds to the historical realities, I think that's kind of how I would answer the question. It's like, look, I'm not really. I'll be honest with you. I'm interested in politics. I'm interested in economics and all that kind of stuff. That's all great. But at the end of the day, in terms of how I approach this question, it's gospel first. That's what I'm interested in. I'm saying, and if people are starting from some other starting point to interpreting this question, then to me they're already off base. If that makes sense. Yeah.
Cool. We'll do kind of one more objection that we've gotten offline, or not in this room. I'm sorry, not offline, but online and outside of this room, and then we'll get back to questions here in the room. So another thing that has been a thing that I've observed just in my own engagement with individuals around this kind of question is that when you really press people, particularly individuals who are like lay people who aren't really studying academic type resources, they're not digging into history and philosophy kind of like we might, like others may, and when you really press them, what tends to be at the base of the question and at the base of their frustration with Christianity is something personal, and it's not to say that this is the case in every case, but in a large number of cases that I've come across, and I'm sure Adam can attest to this in his own life as well, in his own ministry, that a lot of times when you just really say just kind of ask questions as well, why do you think that, or where'd you hear that from, or have you checked out these resources? A lot of people will won't be able to go the length with you, won't be able to go to the distance with you on those questions. And what I found is that you have individuals that may have experienced some kind of hurt within church, where a pastor or a minister or a deacon or even a parent who was a person who went to church all the time, and or even just that that child who was always drugged to church, and now they're like, I'm sick of that. I'm not going to church. But then also you have it to kind of a more dire extent where individuals experience like legitimate trauma. And they run into this very common situation that many believers who seriously contemplate their faith deal with, and that's the problem of evil. The problem of evil being how, it essentially boiling down to this large question of how can God exist, or how can God be all good and exist, and yet there is the existence of evil, or there is this promulgation of these, just heinous things that people do, and so on and so forth. And so, just kind of speak to how that factors in, how those things factor into people asking these kinds of questions. Maybe not this particular question, but this one and others. But then also, kind of, what kind of response would you give to those individuals who that's where they're coming from?
Yeah, that's good, man. That's good. So, I think it's important to remember that human beings are complex. I'm saying they're complex. Everything isn't an intellectual issue. It's just a fact of the matter. I can't assume. One can never assume that I'm just going to argue into the kingdom of God, or I'm going to have some intellectual 1-2 punch that's gonna, be like that silver bullet that, addresses your that one hit quitter that's gonna get whatever question you have. I get that's just not realistic. People are complex. They're intellectual, they're emotional, they're relational, and any worldview that folks would want to have taken seriously has to be able to account for all the aspects of the human experience. I'm saying, and so sometimes when you're dealing with somebody who's got these kind of problem of evil related questions, it's not always time for a response, to be honest with you. I mean, sometimes I remember, I'm just going to be honest. I remember I guess it's been about 7 years ago now. My wife and I, we had a miscarriage. You know what I'm saying? And there was this friend of the family who he was trying to be helpful, you know what I'm saying? And he was just, trying to say something in that awkward moment. He was like, man, one of these days you're going to look back and notice this and just believe this is the best thing that ever could have happened, y'all. And I'm like, and I was thinking in my mind, it took every bit of Holy Ghost in me to not cuss this man out, because that's like the dumbest thing you could possibly say. It's a terrible experience. That's just a dumb thing to say. Hopefully he's not watching this, but but it just wasn't the time for that kind of response, man. I'm saying we're relational beings, we're emotional beings. Sometimes it's really okay to just be with people, and it's the biblical. Actually, I would encourage people to check out. I just did a interview with a apologist named Doug Groothuis on this concept of lament. Like, what does it mean to just be with people in their grieving? I'm saying how powerful that can be. So sometimes that's sufficient. With that being said, you're right. I mean, there is this notion that because there's evil in the world, that somehow how could God exist? And I would just kind of use an analogy. let's say that you hear about this restaurant, right? I've been to some banging restaurants, Big Mamas and all that. Let's say that you go to you hear about this restaurant, and this one chef is supposed to be just a beast. Like whatever he make is just fire. You know what I'm saying? So you're like, man, I'm finna check him out. I'm gonna get out here and see what's up with it. So you go to the restaurant. They make some recommendations. You get the best thing that was recommended to you. You just go for it, right? The food comes out, and it's just nasty. I mean, it's just it's just terrible. It's just there's way too much salt. There's all kind of it's just jacked up, right? And you're like, man, this is terrible. And you look around and you see other people in the restaurant spitting their food out, and you're like, man, who referred me to this place? I mean, everybody is having a bad experience, right? And let's say you leave the restaurant and you go tell your friend that told you to go over there. You're like, man, you was tripping. That thing was nasty, man. I ain't trying to rock with it. So let's say a week later, you find out that the chef really is that good, but unfortunately, there was a waiter, who served the food who believed that, the food needed a little bit extra this, a little bit extra that. And so between the time that the chef prepared it and it got to your table, they had added a little bit of extra this, a little bit extra that, and it made it, just too salty or whatever. You know what I'm saying? So with that being said, in that kind of analogy, the experience that you had, with that meal isn't really reflective of the skill of the chef. You know what I'm saying? Now, in the analogy, obviously the chef, I would say, is God. The meal is your human experience, and the waiter is sin. The fact of the matter is that, sin has entered the world. We have diverged from the way that we're supposed to live and operate in the world such that it's caused brokenness. Everybody knows this. Every worldview has to address, brokenness one way or the other. It's not just a Christian thing. I'm saying we all know the world's jacked up. And we've all had these negative experiences, right? But again, so sin has gotten in the way and contaminated, how we experience the world, right? But with that being said, even with all its contamination, it's not fully, even though it still bears some remnants of how God created, there's these extra elements, right, that are not reflective of God, that chef, right? And so that's how I look at the problem of evil is that, just because you experience some negative things in your life, and just because we understand suffering and brokenness to be a common experience, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's reflective of the goodness of God and who he really is. And so it takes, I think it takes a little bit of kind of teasing our way through that and understanding what the biblical worldview has to say with it more broadly. And shameless plug, I actually have a 3-part series on, why the bad things happen to good people on my YouTube channel and also my podcast that people can check out, where I give a much more detailed response to it. But that's how I at least begin that kind of discussion.
Cool, awesome, thanks, man. So just a quick plug here. So he mentioned his podcast and his website and his YouTube channel. I encourage you, go and check out his content. Adam has some really, really good content. He has different scholars that have come on that he's interviewed. One black scholar and probably one of the, I think he is the only Dead Sea Scroll African American Dead Sea Scroll.
Of African descent, not even just
African
African American.
descent,
The only Dead Sea Scroll scholar of African descent. I just interviewed him about a month or two ago.
Yeah, that was really good, and he's got all kinds of different things, not just addressing this question but others. So his information is there on the screen. Encourage you all to jot it down so that you all can connect with him after this event is over. Of course, we'll stick around just for a little bit after this is over if you want to, just connect with him real quick. But this information here is the best thing that you could write down here. So we'll take maybe one other question from the audience, and then we'll go ahead and we'll wrap up. Would anybody else have a question that hasn't been up before we have some repeats come back up? No? Okay. All right. And nothing new came in online either. So
okay, cool.
Have at it, Stu.
For me, you started with worldview, and as time is short, I guess the one thing I would add to the dialogue is, for me, the challenge of the question is tied up in two things. First of all, I don't view Christianity as a religion. I view Christianity as a philosophy from which many religions flow. Okay. And I think positioning it as a religion creates some of the conflict that you describe, because if the evil people and the good people all belong to the same thing, it's really difficult to kind of separate them out when you want them to be and then have them be together when you don't want them to be. Mm-hmm. Yes, there were abolitionists. There were also Southern Baptists. Sure. So if it's all one thing, then it's all one thing. The second thing is, the question is framed from a white point of view because the notion of race is a European concept. You did an excellent job of establishing the African presence in the beginning of the practice of this religion, but in my understanding, the entire part of the world that we're talking about at that time was Africa. Rome is an African colony, Greece is an African colony, and remained so until the Goths and Visigoths overthrew it. And when Constantine is turning it into empire and he's conquering North Africa, these are African wars. And so all of the people who are participating are Africans. But what happens subsequently, historically, changes the complexion of Rome herself from an African colony into a European empire. And the religion is along for that entire ride. And what comes out of there is not the same thing that that Origen and Tertullian and those guys were developing at the beginning, because it changed from being just something about the philosophy of Christ into an organizing and governmental system to control an empire. And so looking at it coming out of that experience and going into that experience is two literally different things. And so it would be very interesting, perhaps in further dialogue or later dialogue, to perhaps address it from some other world views so that it's not stymied by that Eurocentric notion of what is Africa and what is Europe, so that we can break it out of the notion of what is white men and black men, because once you stick the white and black label on it, it becomes very, very hard to differentiate, and it does have that effect, as you described it, of flattening out history in a way that I think makes it hard to kind of pull apart.
Right. So, one thing I love about philosophy is that it's all about precision of language. You know what I'm saying? So, in some of what you said, I think we'd have to hash out how we define Christianity. How do we define African? Like, what does it mean to be African? I mean, because really, if the first man came from Africa, then we're all Africans one way or the other. So, so what does it even mean to use the term African? So I use it in some very specific ways. And actually, well, I'll get into that later. But when it comes to Christianity, really what we're referring to is it's like saying, like I'm not saying Christianity is true in the sense that, like, vanilla ice cream is better than chocolate or something like that. I think typically when people think about Christianity, you're saying, well, just kind of just however you get down, that's what it is. No, I'm saying Christianity is true in the same sense that 2 + 2 is 4. I'm saying there is a fact of the matter about how the world is, and through the Christian traditions flowing from the Judaic tradition, and even then, before then, flowing from just God's workings in the world, what we call Christianity has always been in this. And actually, Augustine makes this point. You know what I'm saying? Like, Christianity is just the most